Hi, and welcome back to AP News. I'm Adri Briuolo.
And I'm Sydney Esposito. We are now going to discuss the space race. Today, July 17th, 1975, marks the end of the 18-year space race.
Yes, the space race is officially over. The USSR and the USA met in space to establish peace between the two countries. The joining of the two ships marked the end of an era of rivalry between the two of the world's greatest powers. This is now known as the Apollo-Soyuz project. The year was 1957. The Russians launched the Sputnik 1 on October 4th, giving Russia their first point. The Americans felt threatened by these advancements in technology made by the USSR. Before the US could respond, though, USSR sent yet another Sputnik into launch.
The Sputnik 2 was launched on November 3rd of 1957. The Sputnik 2 carried a small dog named Laika into orbit. This was the first living creature that was sent into space. Although the Russians claimed that Laika lived for a week in orbit, in 1967 it was revealed that Laika only lived for a few hours before dying.
Shortly after, in 1958, the first American satellite, Explorer 1, was launched into orbit. It carried scientific tools that led to the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belt. The Explorer 2 gave the US their first point against Russia.
The Americans, before the Russians could respond to the Explorer 1, attempted to launch the Explorer 2, but it failed to reach orbit. Explorer 2's attempted launch was on March 5th of 1958. Shortly after, the U.S. followed up with the launching of the Vanguard 1, which ended up being in orbit for 3 years.
2 months later, on May 17th, the Russians launched the Sputnik 3, which gives Russia yet another point. Now, here's Mackenzie live from the NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Brown. Here, about 17 years ago, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA, was created. This establishment was made after President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act. NASA was a significant contributor all throughout the space race. Now, for more information about NASA and the space race, let's go inside. A little bit over a week after the creation of NASA, Pioneer 1 took off into space, launched by the Americans. The Pioneer 1 reached a height of 70,700 miles. The Russians responded in the beginning of 1959 on January 2nd with the launch of the Luna 1. Luna 1 became the first man-made object to orbit the Sun. The United States retaliated with the launch of Pioneer 4 on an Earth-Moon trajectory. It passed within 37,000 miles of the Moon before falling into a solar orbit. Luna 2 and 3 were both sent into space by the end of 1959, which were a part of the same program as Luna 1. These missions were considered very successful, with Luna 2 being the first man-made object to impact the Moon, and Luna 3 being able to orbit the Moon, and photographing 70% of the Moon's surface. With no major action from the Russians in 1960, they made up for their idleness in 1961, sending the first man into space. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and not only did he reach space, but he orbited the Earth once, becoming the first man to complete that task as well. The Americans realized that they had to act quickly in order to catch up with the Russians and sent Alan Shepard into space on May 5th. Shepard became the first American in space. Later on in the year, in an attempt to come back from the Americans' tough loss to Russia, President Kennedy challenged the nation to have a man reach the Moon by the end of the decade. The U.S. continued their progress by announcing the Gemini project on December 7th in 1961. The Gemini project was NASA's second human spaceflight program and took place between 1961 and 1966. Project Gemini took place between the Mercury and the Apollo projects. Back to you guys in the studio.
Thank you for that look inside NASA, Mackenzie.
Later, throughout the year of 1962, in the United States, John Glenn and Scott Carpenter both completed a mission where they completed 3 orbits around the Earth aboard the Aurora 7.
An exciting change occurred when NASA selected their second set of astronauts in September of '62.
Only a month after, Walter Schirra successfully orbited the Earth 6 times. It was the 5th Mercury flight during that year.
Finally, on December 14th, the Mariner 2 flew past Venus for the first time and entered a solar orbit. The Mariner 2 was an American space probe to Venus and was the first robotic space probe to conduct a successful planetary encounter.
Wow, what an exciting year in the United States.
Yes, and the U.S. kick-started the next year of 1963 by sending Gordon Cooper into space for 34 hours, which made him the last American in space alone. He piloted the Faith 7 spacecraft on a 22-orbit mission, which concluded the operational phase of Project Mercury.
Later that year, on October 17th, NASA's third group of astronauts were selected.
After about 7 months of no advancements, on July 31st, 1964, the Ranger 7 transmitted by the Americans took the first close-range images of the Moon.
In an attempt to catch up to the Americans, on March 18th of 1965, Alexei Leonov spent 12 minutes outside of the Voskhod spacecraft performing the first spacewalk. This was a large step in history.
2 short months later, the Americans had their first spacewalk performed by Ed White. Then, in July of 1964, Mariner 4 returns close-range images of Mars.
Moving in the other direction, the Venus 3 launched by Russia became the first man-made object to impact Venus on March 3rd of 1965. This was yet another advancement for the Russians.
We now go to Cali in front of the Roscosmos State Corporation.
Hi, I'm Callie Fisher, and I'm outside the Roscosmos State Corporation that manages all of the USSR's space travel and technology. On February 3rd, 1966, about 3 months after Venus 3 was launched by Russia, the U.S. launched Luna 9, which reached orbit becoming the first spacecraft to soft land on the moon. And shortly after, Surveyor 1, also from the U.S., soft landed on the moon on June 2nd, 1966, and brought back photos of the surface of the moon. But before Surveyor 1 landed on the moon, the launching of the Luna 10 on April 3rd by the USSR became the first satellite to orbit the moon. Shortly after the USSR launched the satellite, the U.S. retaliated on August 14, 1966 by sending up the Lunar Orbiter 1, which orbited around the moon. The Lunar Orbiter 1 was the first orbiter sent by the U.S. that got all the way around the moon, as well as taking the first pictures of Earth from a distance. The last flight of the Gemini program, called the Gemini 12, was launched on November 11, 1966. This was the 10th flight in the Gemini program that the U.S. sent off. All of these technological advancements made by the USA made Russia feel very threatened. After all, they were the first country to show interest in space travel. It represented the first successful Soviet circumlunar Earth return mission. This was a very large step for the USSR because they were believed to be behind in the so-called space race. Now back to Cindy and Adri in the news station.
Thanks, Callie. Wow, all this struggle for power reminds me of this great book I'm reading.
Oh really? What's it called?
Lord of the Flies. The 2 main characters, Jack and Ralph, have a power struggle that goes on throughout the entire novel. It goes back and forth between who's in charge and has the admiration of the rest of the boys in the book. Very much like the clash of dominance that went on between Russia and the US for all of the space race.
Sounds interesting. I'll make sure to read it. Well, back to the debrief.
Later, in 1968, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders from the United States begin the first manned journey from the Earth to the Moon. On Christmas Eve, they take turns reading Genesis in a broadcast heard from all around the world. Yet another reason for Russia to feel threatened.
In the beginning of the year of 1969, in the USSR, the Soyuz 4 and 5 performed the first Soviet space docking, which was a big advancement for the Russians.
Finally, on July 20th, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin from the United States became the first people to land on the moon. This is when Armstrong said his famous statement,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
After the trip, in a post-flight press conference, Armstrong calls the flight a beginning of a new age, while Collins talks about the future journeys to Mars. On December 15, 1970, the USSR made the first soft landing on Venus and sent back the first signals from another planet.
For yet another advancement for the Russians, on April 23rd of 1971, they launched the Salyut 1, which was the first human-crewed space station ever before sent into space. The USSR seems to be catching up.
In attempts to retaliate, the Americans placed the first mobile vehicle on the moon, the lunar rover, driven by humans, in July of 1971.
The Russians then bounced back with the Mars 2, with the first impact into Mars, and then the Mars 3, which was the first soft Mars landing, all before 1971 ended.
The Americans then retaliated on December 3, 1974, with the first flyby of Jupiter in the Pioneer 10.
This all eventually leads up till today, July 17th of 1975, where just a few hours ago, the Soviets and the Americans accomplished the first joint space docking between 2 nations in the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov shared the first international handshake in space this morning through the open hatch of the Soyuz.
This date will forever go down in history as the official end of the space race.
Yes, there seems to be no clear winner of the space race.
Yeah, neither side really jumps out to me. Anyway, the past 18 years have seemed to go by rather quickly.
They sure have.
Thanks for joining us on this lovely summer day of 1975. I'm Briuolo.
And I'm Sydney Esposito.